I'd always believed that moving to the suburbs would give my son a better life. After years in the city, battling noise, chaos, and crime, I'd saved up enough to get us a small house in what people called a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood. The streets were lined with maple trees, kids rode their bikes in the afternoons, and the houses stood with fresh paint and neatly trimmed hedges. It looked like the American dream, at least on the outside. My name is Alicia Monroe, and I'm a civil rights attorney. I've spent over 15 years fighting discrimination cases, from police brutality to workplace bias. But I never imagined that one day the battle would come right to my own doorstep, or that it would start because of my son, Jonah. Jonah is 12 years old. He was born with spastic quadriplegic cerebral palsy. He can't walk or speak without assistance. But don't let that fool you. He's got the sharpest mind I've ever encountered. He communicates through eye-tracking software and is a math genius. We've always known he'd need more care than most children, and I've made peace with that. What I wasn't prepared for was the cruelty he'd face from adults, grown people who should have known better. It all began innocently enough, or so it seemed. The day we moved into Hollow Creek Estates, several neighbors smiled and waved. Mrs. Delaney brought over banana bread, and a couple of kids from down the street offered to help unload boxes. I thought maybe, just maybe, we'd found a place where Jonah wouldn't be treated as the disabled kid. A place where we could blend in, where people would see him for who he really was. But by the end of the first week, I started noticing things. Our mailbox had been knocked down, not once, but twice. When Jonah's medical van parked in front of the house to unload his wheelchair ramp, someone left a nasty note on the windshield. "This isn't a hospital. Keep your crap out of the street." I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe it wasn't even about Jonah, but my gut told me otherwise. Then came the HOA letter. "We have received multiple complaints about non-conforming modifications to your property, including a wheelchair ramp installed at the front entrance." I stared at the envelope for a long time before calling their office. "Are you serious?" I asked. "You're citing a family with a disabled child for installing a ramp?" "We just enforce the rules," the woman on the phone said in a voice so robotic it made my skin crawl. "You can submit a request for a special accommodation." So I did, and waited. While I waited, Jonah couldn't go in and out of our house safely. I had to physically lift him every morning and evening, and every time I did, my back screamed, and Jonah looked at me with guilt in his eyes. "You're not a burden," I told him. "They are." But it only got worse. One afternoon, I came home to find Jonah in tears. Our home nurse, Teresa, was pacing the living room, fuming. She told me that a man from the HOA had come by unannounced, snapped photos of our house, and told Jonah, my 12-year-old disabled son, that we were in violation of community codes. "He scared him," Teresa said. "Said you could be fined or evicted." That's when I knew this wasn't just about rules. It was personal. They saw my son's disability as a nuisance. They saw our existence as something that didn't fit their perfect picture. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Because I wasn't just a mother. I was a civil rights lawyer, and they'd just made a very big mistake. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake listening to Jonah's breathing monitors softly hum down the hallway, my brain turning over legal strategies and potential violations like a machine. There was something deeply ironic about being a civil rights attorney with decades of courtroom experience, and now having to defend your own home as though it were a hostile witness. The next morning, I did what I always do when someone crosses the line. I documented everything. I started by photographing the ramp. I took detailed shots of the grade, materials, and distance from the sidewalk. Then I cataloged every letter the HOA had sent, highlighted their wording, and marked the dates. I even filed a public records request with the HOA management company, asking for the names and positions of the board members. I was going to know my enemy before I took them on. That same afternoon, I got a knock on the door. I opened it to find a man in his late 60s, wearing a windbreaker with the Hollow Creek Estates logo stitched over his heart like he worked for some small-town sheriff's department. "Mrs. Monroe?" he asked. His tone was clipped, the smile fake. "Yes?" "Name's Walter Sims. I'm the president of the HOA board. I'd like to speak with you about a few issues." I leaned against the doorframe, not inviting him in. "You mean the issue where your board harassed my disabled child while I wasn't home?" His fake smile twitched. "Let's not be dramatic. No one harassed anyone. We're just trying to maintain community standards." I studied him, quiet. "Mr. Sims, I know exactly what you're doing. You're enforcing rules selectively. You've targeted my son's medical accommodations under the guise of aesthetics. That's not just immoral. It's illegal under the Americans with Disabilities Act." Now the twitch in his smile turned to a smirk. "This is private property, ma'am. The ADA doesn't apply here the same way it does to public buildings." "Wrong move, Walter." I stepped forward. "Actually, any housing governed by a homeowners association is subject to the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988, which mandates reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. Denying my son access to our own home is a violation of federal law. Do you really want to go there?" He didn't reply, just gave me a look that said I wasn't welcome. Like I'd brought something dirty into their tidy little world. He turned and walked away without another word. I closed the door, trembling, not from fear, but from rage. The next few days, it got worse. A neighbor, someone I hadn't even spoken to, posted in the community Facebook group. "New family installed an ugly hospital-grade ramp. Doesn't fit the neighborhood? Maybe the city should get involved." A few others chimed in, some with sympathy, others with venom. One woman wrote, "Why should we have to look at that every day? Not our fault their kid's in a wheelchair." I screenshot everything, every post, every comment. This wasn't just bigotry. It was public discrimination, and it gave me what I needed, a paper trail. I scheduled a meeting with Jonah's school therapist to update his accommodation file. I wanted to make sure we had every medical and legal justification on record. Meanwhile, I also contacted the local Department of Fair Housing and submitted an official complaint against Hollow Creek Estates. But that wasn't enough. They needed to be made an example of. So I reached out to the press. A friend of mine worked for a small local news station. I didn't give them our names yet, just sent an anonymous tip. Family with disabled child being targeted by HOA over medically necessary home modifications. They bit. A reporter reached out the next day, asking if I'd be willing to share our story. I said yes, but on my terms. Because if these people wanted a fight, they were going to get one. They picked the wrong mother. They picked the wrong son. And they sure as hell picked the wrong lawyer. The news segment aired on a Thursday evening, right between the weather and the sports. It was only a 5-minute story, but it hit hard. The camera showed footage of our ramp, then cut to the letter the HOA sent me, with the reporter reading aloud, "You are in violation of community standards for unapproved modifications to the front exterior." Then came my interview. They blurred Jonah's face and changed his name, per my request, but I spoke on camera. "My son is disabled. He needs a ramp to safely enter and exit our home. For the HOA to target us for that and to come onto our property to intimidate my child while I wasn't home is not only unethical, it's a violation of federal law." The response online was explosive. Dozens of people, strangers, shared the clip. They flooded the HOA's official page with angry comments. Hashtags popped up, number let Jonah live, number ramp rights, and number HOA from hell. But the exposure had a side effect. It made us even bigger targets. The morning after the story aired, someone spray painted the words "liars" across our driveway in red paint. Jonah saw it from his bedroom window. I'll never forget the look on his face. Not fear, but confusion. Like he couldn't understand how people could be so cruel over something that was supposed to help him. I filed a police report, but of course without witnesses or video, nothing came of it. Then the HOA escalated. They issued a formal warning claiming we violated noise ordinances, even though Jonah can't even speak above a whisper. Another said we left medical equipment visible from the street, referring to the mobile lift in our garage, barely visible through frosted glass. One citation after another, like they were trying to drown us in paperwork, fines, and stress. They weren't just trying to break rules, they were trying to break us. But they forgot who they were dealing with. That weekend, I drove 2 hours to meet with a colleague of mine, Maria Delgado, a civil rights litigator who specialized in housing discrimination cases. I brought her everything: the photos, the letters, the Facebook screenshots, the video from the news segment. She leafed through the stack and raised an eyebrow. "They're not just in violation, they're stupid." I laughed, though there was no humor in it. Maria leaned back in her chair. "You want to make this public or go through the courts?" "Both," I said. "I want an injunction to stop the harassment, and I want the board replaced, permanently." Maria grinned. "Then we'll file under the Fair Housing Act for discrimination against a person with a disability, throw in intentional infliction of emotional distress, and seek damages for every violation and every night your son couldn't sleep in peace." That was when the strategy shifted. No more defense. Now it was war. Back at home, Jonah was getting quieter. He didn't want to go outside anymore. Even with the ramp finally finished, he asked to stay indoors. "They'll be mean," he said through his tablet. "They're just loud," I told him. "Loud people don't win. Smart ones do." But inside I was boiling. No child, no matter their ability, should feel unsafe in their own neighborhood. No mother should have to choose between protecting her child and living in peace. I turned our living room into a war room. Every legal document went into color-coded binders. Every citation we received, I responded to with a letter signed, Alicia Monroe, Esquire. And every time I walked Jonah to the bus, I dared them to look us in the eye. And then, the bomb dropped. An anonymous email came to my work inbox. No subject line, no text, just 2 attachments. I opened them slowly. One was a screenshot of a group message between HOA board members. They were joking about getting the wheelchair kid to move. The other was a scanned letter. A plan. A proposal to amend the bylaws, to ban all future visible medical devices or modifications unless approved by a 2/3 vote. That wasn't just a violation. That was a conspiracy. And now I had proof. They thought they were pushing around a single mother. They didn't know I was building a federal case. I remember walking into the courthouse with Maria by my side, thick files tucked under our arms. She looked calm, the way good attorneys always do, steel under velvet. But I could feel the tension vibrating inside me like a pulled wire. This wasn't just any case. This was my son's future. We sued the Hollow Creek Estates Homeowners Association under the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988, claiming discrimination based on disability, failure to provide reasonable accommodations, retaliation for requesting those accommodations, emotional distress inflicted upon a minor violation of civil rights under federal law. Maria added a motion for a preliminary injunction, asking the court to bar the HOA from issuing further citations or taking any retaliatory actions against us while the case was pending. We had exhibits, dozens of them. Letters, social media posts, photos, HOA emails, that disgusting group chat about getting the wheelchair kid to move. It was all there. And we named names. Walter Sims, Carol Dietrich, Mark Ingram, 3 of the 5 board members, each of them complicit, each of them liable. The media picked it up within 24 hours. It exploded bigger than I expected. HOA sued for harassing disabled child. Mother fights back. Suddenly, people I hadn't heard from in years were calling, emailing, even texting me. "You're doing the right thing. Give them hell, Alicia. My sister's disabled. We went through the same thing. Thank you for standing up." That kind of support mattered. It reminded me I wasn't alone. Jonah wasn't alone. But the neighborhood? That was a different story. The day after the news broke, someone slashed our tires. All 4 of them. I stood in the driveway, staring at the damage, Jonah beside me in his chair, blinking at the mess. This wasn't just harassment now. It was sabotage. It was hate. I called the police, but once again, no suspects, no witnesses. Just file a report and we'll follow up. That same night, I received a typed letter in our mailbox, unsigned and unsealed, which meant it hadn't come through the post office. Maybe you and your kid don't belong here. Some of us worked hard to make this place beautiful. It was the last straw. I sat at my desk and wrote a personal letter to every resident of Hollow Creek Estates. A single page, printed on heavy white paper. "Dear neighbor, you may have seen the news. Yes, I am suing the HOA. Yes, I am doing it on behalf of my disabled son, who has been bullied, threatened, and mistreated in the one place that was supposed to be safe. If you've been silent, I ask you, why? If you've spoken against us, I ask you, what would you do if it were your child? And if you're tired of living under a board that abuses its power and hides behind rules to mask cruelty, I invite you to stand with us. There will be a vote to remove the board. Do what's right, not what's easy." Alicia Monroe. I slipped a copy into every mailbox on our block. I wasn't just fighting to win the lawsuit anymore. I was fighting to change the neighborhood itself. 2 weeks later, the court granted our preliminary injunction. The judge's language was scathing. The plaintiff has presented compelling evidence of targeted harassment and discriminatory enforcement of community rules under the guise of aesthetic standards. In one ruling, the HOA was ordered to cease all enforcement actions against our property, remove all fines and warnings issued to us, Refrain from any communication not conducted through legal counsel. They couldn't even send us a note without risking contempt of court. And that wasn't the end. The court set a trial date. Maria and I were ready. But something else was brewing. Something bigger than lawsuits and motions. The neighborhood itself had started to turn. A few residents knocked on my door that week, quietly, privately. One woman, Emily, said, "I'm ashamed. I saw what they were doing and stayed quiet. I didn't want to get involved, but after seeing what they said about your son, I just want you to know I support you." Another man, a single father 2 blocks down, offered to testify that his request to build a handrail for his elderly mother had also been denied, until he threatened to leave the HOA. Whispers turned into voices. People began organizing a special meeting, a recall vote, to remove the current board. According to the bylaws, it only required signatures from 30% of homeowners to trigger it. They got 40%. Walter Sims was about to learn that the very community he thought he controlled was turning against him. He didn't just lose the moral fight. He was about to lose his seat of power. The recall meeting was set for a chilly Saturday evening in late February. Hollow Creek Estates normally held HOA meetings in the small clubhouse at the edge of the neighborhood, but this time they had to move it to the local elementary school cafeteria because the turnout was far bigger than anyone expected. I parked in the lot, helped Jonah into his chair, and rolled him through the double doors. The room buzzed like a courtroom before opening statements. People I barely knew greeted us, some with a nod, some with quiet apologies, and others with full-throated support. Jonah clutched his favorite plush turtle in his lap and looked around. "Is this for me?" he asked, tapping the words into his tablet. I leaned close. "Yes, baby. This is all for you." At the front table sat the board. Walter Sims with his arms folded across his chest, looking like a king whose castle was under siege. Beside him, Carol Dietrich whispered to someone, clearly agitated. Mark Ingram flipped through papers like the outcome could still be changed by bureaucracy. Too late. A woman named Sheila, who had just moved in 6 months ago and quickly became one of our biggest allies, stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for coming. We're here to vote on the removal of the current HOA board under Article 4, Section 3 of the Hollow Creek Estates bylaws." The crowd murmured, some surprised, others already set. Sheila continued, "Before we vote, we'll hear from both sides. First, the board." Walter stood. "I'll be brief," he said, clearing his throat. "Our job as the HOA is to protect home values, enforce standards, and maintain the character of this community. The recent lawsuit and media attention have made that difficult, but I assure you, we acted within our rights." That was it. No apology, no remorse. He sat down, smug as ever. Then Sheila called me forward. I didn't bring notes. I didn't need them. I stood behind the mic, looked around the room, and began. "My name is Alicia Monroe. I'm a civil rights attorney. I moved here with my son Jonah for the same reasons as all of you. Safety, good schools, a sense of community." I paused. "My son has a neurological disorder that makes walking impossible. He uses a wheelchair. The ramp we installed didn't reduce your home's value. It gave my son access to his." I reached into my bag and pulled out the photo of Jonah sitting on the front step the day we moved in, smiling, unaware of the storm that was about to fall on us. Since then, Jonah has been harassed. We've been fined, shamed, and threatened. not for breaking laws, but for needing accommodations, for being different, for existing. I let the silence settle. The law doesn't care if you're uncomfortable with wheelchairs. The law cares about equity, fair treatment, humanity, and as a community, we have to care about those things too. I held up the HOA's own letter demanding the removal of the ramp. This board didn't just fail my son, it failed all of you. Because when they chose to act like tyrants instead of neighbors, they exposed this entire neighborhood to legal risk, public shame, and moral decay. People clapped. Real claps. Loud, sustained. I nodded and stepped back. Walter looked like he'd swallowed a brick. The vote wasn't even close. Out of the 112 ballots cast, 89 voted to remove the board. 18 voted against. 5 abstained. Walter Sims, Carol Dietrich, and Mark Ingram were immediately stripped of their positions. 3 interim members were nominated and approved that night. Their first act, issuing a formal written apology to Jonah. Their second, repealing the rule changes proposed by the former board and issuing new guidance on disability accommodations in the neighborhood. The tide had turned. We didn't just win in court, we won on our street. Over the next few weeks, the air felt lighter. People smiled more. Neighbors stopped by with baked goods, books, little gifts for Jonah. Kids who had once stared at his wheelchair now asked him to play video games online. He started wheeling himself out to the curb just to feel the sun. And one afternoon, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, Jonah rolled up beside me. "I like it here now," he said through his tablet. I looked at the ramp, at the garden, at the house we fought for. "I do too," I said. But I wasn't done yet, because justice is more than winning a battle. It's making sure no one else has to fight the same one alone. The lawsuit didn't end with the recall vote. We still had the court date. Despite being stripped of their board positions, Walter, Carol, and Mark were personally named in the lawsuit, and they couldn't wriggle out of it with resignation papers. Their attorney tried the usual tactics: delay, deflect, downplay. But the court didn't bite. The judge was sharp and direct. "Your clients were in a position of power," she said during a pre-trial hearing, "and they used that power to punish a child with a disability." When the day of the trial came, Jonah didn't need to testify, but I brought him anyway. I wanted the court and the defendants to see the person their actions had harmed. Maria delivered a devastating opening argument, followed by witness after witness. Neighbors testified to the slurs they overheard, the threats, the culture of fear. The email screenshots and group chats were authenticated and admitted into evidence. And then I took the stand. I spoke not just as Jonah's mother, but as an attorney, a citizen, a neighbor. I walked the jury through every moment of intimidation, every citation, every sleepless night when my son asked if we'd have to leave. "You don't get to do this," I said firmly. "You don't get to run a community like a dictatorship. Not in America. Not on my watch." When the verdict came back, I held Jonah's hand in mine. We won. The jury found all 3 defendants liable for discrimination and awarded $125,000 in compensatory damages, $300,000 in punitive damages. A court order mandating anti-discrimination training for all future HOA board members in Hollow Creek Estates. It wasn't about the money. It was about the message. You do not mess with people just because they're different or vulnerable. And you certainly don't mess with a civil rights lawyer's child. We used part of the settlement money to install solar panels on the roof, a new garden path out back, and widen the sidewalks on both sides of our property. Not because we needed to, but because we could, and because it sent a message. Access is not an eyesore. It's a right. I created a nonprofit in Jonah's name, the Ramp Project, to provide free or low-cost accessibility upgrades to families facing HOA resistance. We worked with builders, lawyers, and lawmakers. Within 6 months, we helped 8 families in 3 states avoid the nightmare we lived through. The story kept spreading. It was picked up by a national talk show. I was interviewed, and so was Jonah, sitting proudly beside me with a small mic clipped to his shirt and his tablet in hand. The host asked him, "What do you want people to learn from what happened to you?" Jonah tapped, and the voice reader said, "Being different doesn't mean you don't belong." The audience clapped. I cried. One day in spring, as the flowers bloomed along our front walk and the new HOA board hosted a barbecue in the community park, wheelchair accessible, of course, I caught Jonah looking around, smiling. "Do you feel safe now?" I asked. He nodded, then typed, "I feel home." And that was everything. We didn't just survive the war. We rebuilt the world better than it was before. One ramp at a time,